Hello, welcome to Denton's Tales of the Viking Age. In this video, I'll be talking about a very interesting deity from Norse mythology, one who might not have the beauty and physical appeal of Freya, nor the strength of Thor, didn't give gifts like Idun with her youth-preserving apples, nor play tricks on people like Loki, but in her own way was fascinating, and played a most important role in the Norse pantheon. More powerful in some ways than Odin himself, as we shall see. She is mentioned extensively in the Prose Edda, written in Iceland by Snorri Sturluson, who lived from circa 1179 to 1241 AD, in the poems collected in the Poetic Edda, and in the works of the historian Saxo Grammaticus, 1160 to 1220 AD. Her name is Hel, spelled with one L, and no A added on. She was Hel, not Hela, as she is often incorrectly called. Nor did she sprout huge horns out of her head that resembled the antlers of some massive stag that suddenly appeared every now and again, while wearing a clinging black catsuit, as the woefully awful Thor Ragnarok movie would suggest. But then, why would they get Hel right when they got everything else wrong as well? According to Snorri, she was the daughter of the notorious trickster god Loki and the female Jotun or giant Angerboda. And she had two brothers, Fenrir, a huge savage wolf, and an enormous snake known as Jormungandr, which means giant monster. Her correct full name would be Hel Lokisdottir. She also had a half-brother, the eight-legged horse Sleipnir, which her father Loki had given birth to while shapeshifted into the form of a mare, and which he subsequently gave to Odin. Loki did things like that. An interesting family. And you know, what an incredible childhood she must have had. After all, how many girls can claim a wolf, a snake, and an eight-legged horse as brothers? Family gatherings in Loki's hall must have been, well, different, to put it mildly. Now, she did actually have a normal brother, well, as normal as anything connected with Loki was likely to be, named Narfi, a son of Loki by his wife, Sigyn. Yes, Loki had a wife, as well as his romantic flings with Angerboda and the stallion Svadilfari. He certainly got around. Though, of course, he was not the only Norse god to do so. Freya, for example, did not become known as a goddess of love and things romantic just by drawing numbers out of a hat. Oh, no. Hel is described in the Poetic Edda as being half normal flesh-coloured and half blue, or in other words, being half normal and half corpse-like, presumably that bluish tint seen in recently dead bodies, and to have a somewhat downcast, gloomy appearance. Well, hardly surprising, I suppose, if she were half dead. She is, however, often depicted by artists in far more extreme ways. Half normal and half rotting flesh, or half skull with one arm and a leg being just bone with little bits of flesh dangling from it, or deformed or hag-like. I've even seen her described as hunchbacked and twisted, but there's nothing in the sagas nor in the Eddas to suggest anything of the kind. There is no reference to her actually being ugly or malformed as such, nor to parts of her being just bones without flesh. Even her strange two-tone skin coloration is only mentioned by Snorri. Nor is it clear even how that was distributed. Artists, of course, frequently showing her with her face and body split vertically in two, normal on one side and blue on the other. But there's no actual description of that. Snorri merely refers to the coloration without any further details. I suppose one should probably think of her as, well, a reasonably normal-looking woman with strangely coloured skin, according to Snorri, or perhaps just a normal-looking woman, since one would wonder how such a remarkable feature was ignored by everyone else, and might well be simply a bit of embellishment by Snorri, who was rather inclined to do that, and more of that in a moment. Now, the word Hel comes from an Indo-European root, kel, that became Hel in Old Norse, meaning to cover, to hide something. The word helmet comes from the same root, meaning something covering the head. So that the name of the goddess may be seen as meaning the one who covers, referring to someone covered as in a grave, a covered place. To be in Hel meaning to be buried. And that name, of course, belongs to both the realm of the dead itself and the ruler of that realm. And that is all she was, the ruler of the realm of the dead, nothing more. Hel was not the goddess of death as such, but rather goddess of those who were dead, which, is not quite the same thing, insofar as she had no responsibility for death. She did not control it. She did not cause it. She didn't choose how, when, or where people died. She didn't actually kill anyone. She merely looked after them once they were dead. She took care of them, provided for them. That was all. Odin's orders to her as ruler of Hel were to provide for those sent to her. He said nothing about her going out and getting a few herself just to pass the time on a slow day. Nor was she evil or cruel. She is often portrayed as this nasty, fearsome creature. She was not a goddess to be feared. It was death itself that might be feared, not Hel. She did not bring death. You could say death brought her. And in many cases, of course, such as where someone was suffering extreme pain as they neared the end of their lives, Hel would have been seen as a most welcome goddess, the bringer of the end of their suffering, welcomed by the one who lay dying as well as those around them. But more of that in a moment. There is a popular concept that the Norse gods were given specific tasks, that they were god or goddess of something, that they all had a job description, if you like, which they had to stick to. Thor was god of thunder, or Freya was goddess of love, for example, and Hel was goddess of death. But that's not quite true. Norse deities had more of what one could call an association with things rather than being responsible for them as such, actually controlling them. They were more like patrons of them, not controlling them as, say, did the Greek gods, such as when Persephone would go to Hades, there was winter on Earth because she wasn't there to keep it summer. She and her mother Demeter were the summer. Without them, it couldn't happen. But that wasn't quite the Norse concept. Things could happen in Midgard on their own without the gods having to lift a finger. Thor, for example, did not have any responsibility for thunder and lightning, nor did he control the weather, just as Freya had no control over or responsibility for love. People fell in love without any designated assistance from her, and had she done like Persephone and gone off to chat with Hel for 6 months, nothing would have changed. People would still have fallen in love, had sex, made babies, and so on in her absence. Everything would have chugged along in Midgard just the same. But she was associated with love. She became its patron due to her own considerable romantic activities. And of course, she sympathizes with those who are in love and helps them if needs be. And in one poem, Odin actually says that she enjoys listening to love songs and should be prayed to by those in love, but she has no official duty to control love. Just as Thor was associated with thunder, but he had no official duties regarding it. And in fact, he's never mentioned in the sagas as doing anything connected with it, nor had Loki anything to do with fire. And as I've said, Hel had nothing to do with death. As such, she was simply the custodian of those who were already dead. But to return to Hel and her siblings. Loki's 3 unusual offspring initially lived in the home of their mother, Jotunheim, the realm of the giants. But the gods were not exactly happy when they learned about the curious trio. For one thing, giants were not always to be trusted, and the gods were very wary of them. They had a history with giants, despite the fact that the gods themselves often had sex with giants. Some of them even married giants, and they had children with them. Thor, for example, was the son of Odin and the Jotun woman Jord. Odin himself was the son of a Jotun woman, and there were giants even among the gods, Skadi being a Jotun. And Tyr was the son of 2 Jotun parents, which makes him pretty much one himself. But the combination of giants and Loki was disturbing, and we are told that the gods traced prophecies that great mischief and disaster would arise for them as a result. Consequently, Odin had the children brought to Asgard, or Asgard, as it is in English. And seeing the increasing size of Fenrir, because Fenrir wasn't just your ordinary sort of dog-sized wolf, no, he was room-sized and growing. He ordered him bound, during which the god Tyr lost a hand. And Jormungandr was sent to what was described as that great sea that lies around all lands, where hopefully he wouldn't cause any great trouble. Not that that was very likely to happen. That left Hel. Odin sent her to Niflheim, the realm of mists, giving her very clear instructions and granting her authority over the dead of the 9 worlds, all the dead, instructing her to administer board and lodging to all those sent to her. Her region in Niflheim would later become known as Helheim, the realm of Hel, though that name wasn't used to begin with. It's a much more modern conception. And during the Viking Age, Hel, as I've said, would have been the name used as both that of the place and of its ruler. A bit confusing, of course, because you might not always know which one someone was talking about. Now, the Norse Hel, as described in pre-Christian times, was not a place of everlasting fire and torment, eternal screaming damnation, like the Christian version, spelled with 2 L's. It was really little more than not at all an unpleasant continuation of life, described as having great mansions with high walls and huge gates. It was warm and sunny and green, rather like the spring in Midgard. Flowers grew there, and Hel's High Hall, as it was called, was beautiful, a bright and comfortable building where people were served with mead. Nor was it entirely below ground, since there are references to at least some of it being visible from other locations. And, as I've said, the sun is mentioned as shining there. So, assuming that was not just a special sun for Hel, it could not have been entirely underground. Indeed, had it lain entirely in some kind of cavern, it would hardly have needed a wall around it. It could be reached by going down and to the north, crossing over a river by a bridge, and continuing on the road before coming to Hel's Gate. In Scandinavia to this day, a polite way, if you like, to tell someone where they can go to is to tell them to go down and north, or, in other words, go to Hel. When Balder, the son of Odin and Frigg, is killed by the trickery of Loki, and he goes to Hel, she welcomes him and his wife, Nanna, who had thrown herself on the funeral pyre with him, receiving them with obvious warmth. She's considerate and kind, having the benches strewn with rushes to make them comfortable, and special mead brewed. She lays on a feast for them, with gold rings everywhere, and Balder sits in the place of honour beside her at her table, a high seat, which hardly suggests a realm of misery and suffering. People seemingly carried on much as they had done when they were alive, eating, sleeping, playing games, carousing, fighting, and so on. The fact that Hel fed those in her realm, that there was food and drink there, seemed significant, in that it was clearly there purely for purposes of enjoyment, not necessity, since, well, nutrition was hardly required by the dead. You couldn't really starve to death when you were already dead. And when Hermodr goes to Hel to see if he can get Balder back, which I'll be discussing a bit later, we get a very clear impression that the Norse Hel was far from a miserable, punishing place, since Balder actually walks Hermodr back to the gate. He gives him gifts to take back to Asgarda for his parents, and Nanna also sends back gifts, a robe of linen for Frigg and a finger ring for Fulla. So not only are Balder and his wife clearly not in any great distress, but it would seem there must be a gift shop in Hel, since they are even able to obtain gifts in the realm of the dead to send back to the realm of the living. Something very unlikely in the Christian version of fire and brimstone. That linen robe wouldn't have done very well in the flames of the Christian Hel. But see, this did not suit the early church, who regarded heaven as a paradise and hell as eternal torment. And as we shall see in a moment, that led to an increasing adaptation, if you like, of the Old Norse beliefs to a more Christian version, as well as perhaps actual variations in those beliefs over time or geographical location. Only one Old Norse poem actually mentions anything about punishment for the dead for their crimes, and that is Volspa, the first poem in the Poetic Edda, thought to most probably date from the time when Iceland was converting to Christianity. In it, a place is mentioned that sits on the Northroad, the shore of corpses, which is said to be far from the sun with a gate facing north, to have poison dripping from the ceiling and snakes encircling the walls, where the monster Nithog will suck the corpses of murderers, oath-breakers, and adulterers, and snap them in his jaws. There's no mention of Hel herself regarding this place, nor any role she might play in it, nor is it mentioned anywhere else. But now we come to a most interesting thing. Who among the dead went where? Warriors who died bravely in battle with weapons in their hands were carried aloft by the Valkyries, to Odin's great hall, Valhall, its name meaning the hall of those slain in battle, or at least some of them were, there to fight, get drunk, and feast with the gods, till the final great battle that would end the world, the Ragnarok. But not all the dead were evenly distributed between those who died with a sword in their hand and those who didn't, one lot to Valhall and the rest to Hel, though Hel's realm of the dead was, of course, the largest. It had the greatest population, obviously. Ron, a sea goddess, was said to take those who drowned at sea, gathering them in with her net, while the goddess Gefn, herself a virgin, took those unwed women who died as virgins. Some people who had distinguished themselves in one way or another were taken by Thor, while the very righteous, who would survive the end of the world, Ragnarok, will go to Gimli, where there is a golden-roofed hall. Freyja is mentioned by the disguised Odin in the poem Grimnismal as taking many of the warriors who died in battle herself, rather than their going to Valhall, allotting them seats in her hall, Sessrumir, located in a meadow in Åsgardr called Folkvanga. But there are contradictions. Early in Norse mythology, the dead could go to quite a number of locations, such as those I mentioned, among others, but later on the choices grew less. And by the time Christians had finished with Norse paganism, it really came down to only two locations: Åsgardr up there and Hel down there. The Christian concept of heaven and hell, a concept that really had no status in pagan beliefs. We must remember that a lot of what has come down to us about Norse beliefs has been coloured to greater or lesser extent by those who recorded it, since the likes of the Eddas were written down in the 13th century and written down by Christians, about which I'll have more to say, preserving what had for centuries been verbal tales, pagan tales, recounted by storytellers and poets called skalds, or told by people sitting around the fire on long winter's nights to pass the time. Though the Norse could write, they did have a written language using runes. Had they chosen to use it, they didn't, at least not to write books, using it instead for inscriptions on monuments or on talismans for ornamental purposes. They put up large stones with inscriptions of the Eric was here or Håkon went off and died somewhere sort of thing. But they didn't record their history or stories of the gods in written form, which is a great pity. The extent of how much was altered or coloured by the Christian beliefs of men like Snorri is hard to say, but there is considerable evidence of Christianization, you might say, particularly in Snorri's prose Edda, though far less in Saxo's writings, and the poetic Edda seems overall to be, reasonably unaltered, though Christian influence is still clearly present. The poems contained in the Poetic Edda are a mixed bag, if you like, a collection of tales by unknown authors from differing periods of Norse history. What Dr. Jackson Crawford, an expert on all Old Norse subjects, refers to as what today we would call the best of, or perhaps an iTunes playlist, and are closer to the originals than Snorri's tales. And variations or contradictions contained in them could well reflect genuine variations in beliefs that occurred over time, as well as deliberate alterations. Saxo's work is also older than Snorri's, and while he mentions many of the same things that Snorri does, there are considerable differences in others. His Christianization of the tales seems to have been far less than Snorri's. In the prose Edda, Snorri retells many of these tales, but adding his own interpretation and explaining them, sometimes seeming to suggest that he was actually trying to make it look as though some pagan beliefs foreshadowed Christian ones, making an acceptable link between the two, and on occasions even contradicting something said elsewhere. For example, we read of companies of warriors killed in battle riding the road to Hel, not being taken aloft to feast in Valhall. Yet at the same time we read that dead warriors went to Åsgardr. An early skaldic poem mentions a king who is killed in battle and is then taken by Hel to her realm. And in the poem Fafnismal, it is clearly stated that everyone, no matter who they are, goes to Hel, that being the realm of the dead, which indeed fits Odin's orders to Hel in the first place. So, was Hel seen initially as the default recipient for all the dead, with Valhall being a later conception, perhaps even a change of mind by Odin, who decided to keep warriors in Åsgardr in preparation for the final great battle, Ragnarok, or simply a variation due to either differing or changing aspects of religious belief, or invented altogether, though the latter seems unlikely. One interesting possible clue in regards to that lies in the names given to the wall that surrounded Hel, or at least one of them. It was known as Norgalinder, meaning corpse fence, Helgalinder, the fence of Hel, and rather oddly as Valgalinder, which means the fence of the fallen, but the fallen in a very particular sense, since Val meant one who died in battle, specifically a fallen warrior, from which we get Valhall, meaning the hall of the warriors slain in battle, as well as Valkyria, the Valkyries, which means the choosers of the warriors slain in battle, from Val and Kyria, which was a feminine form for one who chooses something. So one name from Hel's outer wall seems to imply that warriors did indeed go there, even if only in transit elsewhere. And Saxo mentions warriors fighting and training in Hel just as they were supposed to do in Valhall. There is also mention in one of the sagas of so-called Hel shoes, which were fitted onto the feet of dead warriors so they could walk on to Valhall after passing through Hel, though why they needed them as against their own footwear isn't stated, which seems to indicate again that everyone went to Hel to begin with, whatever about subsequent destinations they might be sent to. It must be borne in mind that most of our written accounts, like the Eddas, come from Iceland. And just because something may have been true in Iceland does not mean it was true everywhere else, or that it was true for the entire period of Norse history. It's more than possible that there were differing forms of the Old Norse religion, say between Iceland and Denmark, or between Sweden and settlements in Ireland, just as there are differing forms of Christianity, Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, any number of Protestant sects, and there are differing forms of Judaism, as well as two variations of Islam. So the same is quite possible to have been the case among the Norse people, since we know very little about the actual details of the worship of the Norse gods, the ceremonies and so forth. So differing versions of the same thing found in the Eddas or the various sagas might well all be correct, or correct at different periods in history or different geographical locations, apart from the obvious alterations made by Snorri. Religions can change greatly over periods of time, as we see with Christianity, which is quite different in many ways from what it was in, say, the 13th century. Then, of course, there are traditions handed down in Scandinavian folklore from one generation to another that might be even closer to the truth. I've seen the death of Balder also mentioned in the context of who went where when they died, in that despite his dying in a brutal manner, he went to hell rather than Valhall. But I don't see it that way. For one thing, though he met a violent end, struck down by a piece of mistletoe thrown by the blind god Hodor at the instigation of Loki, he was not killed in battle. He didn't die in combat with a weapon in his hand. And come to think of it, being blind, he could hardly be said to be a warrior, even if he'd had a sword in both hands and an axe stuck in his belt. And thus I would see his death as accidental, though it was a contrived accident, of course, which would have made him one of Hel's subjects, as I see it. I don't think he qualified for that free ride by a Valkyrie. But of course, going by the sagas and old poems, you could simply say Balder went to Hel because he was dead, and dead people, gods included, went there. Hel having been given authority over all the dead, not just some of them, even if in many cases that was temporary, such as warriors moving on to Valhall. Christianity plays such an important part in all of this, since it is Christians who bring most of our knowledge of the Norse gods down to us, their version of it at least, so that even very old poems or sagas that were told verbally centuries before Christian times were still recorded in Christian times, and influenced to greater or lesser degrees by that fact. It's pretty obvious that Snorri considerably exaggerated Hel's unpleasantness, for example, to bring it more in line with a Christian vision of Hell as a thoroughly nasty place, and to make his interpretation of the pagan version seem a sort of vision of the future Christian ideas, making it more acceptable to those of his own time. Such as Hell sleeping in a bed called illness, eating from a dish called hunger, with a knife famine, the curtains that hung in her abode called bleak misfortune, the threshold of her doorway known as stumbling block, as well as having servants named slow and lazy, who moved so slowly, in fact, that nobody could see them move, and so forth. Since there's no mention of that anywhere else, that's pure Snorri. And it seems to contradict Hel's welcoming feasts for honoured guests, as well as Odin's instructions to her when he sent her to Niflheim to begin with, telling her to provide for those people sent into her care. He didn't tell her to make them bloody miserable while she was at it, nor to hire servants who were so damn slow they'd be completely useless. If Hel had ordered a hot meal, it would have had mould growing on it by the time she got it. It is also Snorri that tells us of the Valkyries actually bringing warriors to Åsgard to feast with the gods in Valhall, though Valkyries themselves are mentioned in many of the old stories, and so that has been questioned as to its truthfulness. Did they pick up dead warriors and take them aloft? It seems to me that there was nothing to be gained from a Christian viewpoint by Snorri making that up, unlike making Hel seem much worse than it actually was, since there was no perception in Christian belief for warriors getting special treatment in heaven. It didn't make any difference if you were a warrior or not. It was pious behavior and being nice to the church, especially being very nice to the church financially, that got you a good seat in heaven. It would have been pointless for Snorri to invent that. Were he going to embellish something for Christian consumption, he would surely have had good, pious people being taken aloft to Åsgard as a reward for their goodness, not warriors, since that would have fitted the Christian viewpoint. And of course, I suppose we must also consider the fact that, despite his Christian leanings, he was near enough to those times, only 200 years or so after Iceland converted to Christianity, that, he could have known some old person whose grandfather told them something their grandfather had told them, a tale perhaps never written down. And as I've said, there are a number of references in the sagas to Valkyries on the battlefield choosing who lived and who died. So we know that the Valkyries were indeed part of Norse religious belief. Taking all that into consideration, I'm inclined to accept Snorri's account of them to be perhaps simply a variation of genuine Norse belief. Now, he may have moved Valhall skywards to Asgard, since it's been suggested that it originally was somewhere in Hell itself, given the mentions of warriors in Hell and the meaning of the name Valhall. And moving it up would fit the Christian concept of any kind of reward in the afterlife being up there in heaven. And of course, if you want to keep the image of Valhall in Hell, the Valkyries, in that case, well, they could just as easily have assisted warriors to go to it wherever it was. They are mentioned in one poem as being ready to ride to the earth, suggesting that indeed they did come down from somewhere, presumably Asgard. The sagas and the poems of the Poetic Edda, as well as Saxo's writings, agree with Snorri on some things connected with Hell. The river with the bridge across it on the road to Hell and the Hell Gate, for example, but they differ wildly on others. Saxo paints Hell as a green and pleasant realm with pretty flowers growing in it, recounting in his Gesta Danorum, the history of the Danes, how the hero Hadding passes through sunny, fertile regions where herbs grow, encountering armies of fallen warriors engaged in eternal battle, whereas Snorri says it's dark and foreboding, a place of misery and everlasting despair. One being what seems to be the correct Old Norse version, the other clearly adapted to fit Christian ideas of a good place, heaven, and a bad place, hell. But don't get me wrong, Snorri is still a great source of information on various aspects of the Norse peoples, just as long as you keep in mind that religious topics have been doctored to greater or lesser extent, whereas the poems in the Poetic Edda, many of the sagas, and the work of Saxo have not been altered to the same extent, or probably even not at all in cases where there is no religious conflict with Christian teachings. But of course, sadly, it's not just Norse mythology. The same can be said of most historical records, since it was Napoleon, I think, who said, "History is written by the victors." And that's perfectly true. Most of history is slanted by who wrote it, especially, of course, warfare. The enemy bombed innocent civilians. They are evil monsters. Yes, but you did the same thing. You bombed innocent civilians. Well, yes, of course we did. We had to win the war, after all. Yes. For a balanced picture of most historical events, I think you need to be able to see what we wrote about it, what they wrote about it, put the two together, see what matches, allow for political and religious bias, and that's probably what actually happened, not what they taught you in school. I can understand and sympathize with Snorri Sturluson, because he clearly had a respect and a liking for the old ways. Obviously, he wasn't a highly prejudiced, Bible-thumping Christian, if you like, who regarded anything pagan as the evil work of Satan, or he wouldn't have written the Prose Edda in the first place, or he would have added even more lurid, evil things to it. Vile things would have happened on every page. He wanted to preserve the traditions of the Old Norse poets, to show future writers how to follow in their footsteps, but he would have had to be careful in doing that. He couldn't praise the old gods in glowing terms, or he'd have attracted very unfavourable attention to himself. The conversion of many Norse territories was due in no small measure to the extreme brutality of King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, who helped people to change their faith by torturing or killing them, and destroying pagan temples and images, and any display of a pagan emblem, wearing something like the hammer of Thor, for example, would have been, well, rather bad for one's health. And Iceland had been Christian for 200 years by Snorri's time, so the faith was firmly established, and would not have looked kindly on anyone rocking the boat, so to speak. This was getting well into the Middle Ages, after all, and right across Europe, people who expressed ideas that differed from those of the church tended to be invited to barbecues in the town square. The trouble was, they were the barbecue. So if he adapted pagan ideas, moulding them to a form that suggested the Christian viewpoint, they became less pagan, less evil, bringing them closer to what was seen as acceptable. A little gloss of the true faith gave them a veneer of respectability, especially the suggestion that somehow the pagans had sensed the true beliefs that were to come from Christianity, such as the heaven and hell concept. It made the pagans seem, well, less pagan. Whether Snorri simply saw the Old Norse beliefs as a beautiful form of poetry and imagination, a wonderful art form, if you like, that should be preserved regardless of whatever it was, or he was secretly a believer himself to some extent, I don't know. But either way, his additions and changes are understandable, if regrettable. But let us return to hell, in this video at least. In some ways, hell, however you see her, was even more powerful than Odin, since once someone entered her realm, no one, not even the All-Father himself, could get them back again without her permission. She obeyed no one but herself. Her will was absolute in her own realm. There are stories of tell how she might ride out, however, mounted on her white three-legged horse, the hell horse, seeking those who were ready to enter her realm during plagues or famines, gathering them in and taking them with her. And presumably she will ride that same horse when she takes those residing in her realm to join the great battle of Ragnarok. But just as she could ride out, others could ride into hell, people who were not dead, as we see in the story of the death of Balder, where Hermodr is sent by Odin to see if Hel will return Balder, taking Odin's 8-legged horse Sleipnir for the journey. After riding for 9 nights along the Helvinger, the Hell Road, and traversing deep dark valleys, he comes to the river Gjoll, and he crosses it by a bridge with a roof of gold. He is confronted by a woman named Mogada, a young woman seemingly by the word used to describe her, she being the guardian of the bridge. She asks him why he, clearly not dead, since, as she says, he is not the colour of a corpse, wishes to enter hell. He explains his mission, which ultimately fails, of course, and she then allows him to proceed. Odin himself, also very much alive, visits hell to consult with the dead Volva, showing that even living persons could enter and leave again if they had sufficient reason to do so, and that hell could be reached reasonably easily from the realm of the living. Simply ride down and along the road to the north, cross the bridge, explain itself to the guardian, and carry on. There was nothing that forbade visitors to hell's domain, if they had sufficient reason to do so. There is an assumption, I think, that hell was rather a minor goddess, relegated to a nasty and dismal task underground, worshipped by very few and feared by all. But that really, again, is the result of later Christian influence, seeing the old gods as representing either good or evil, since death was something unpleasant. Therefore hell was an evil goddess. Love was a nice thing, so Freya was a good goddess. Well, as good as a pagan goddess would ever be. But the pagans, they didn't see it that way. They didn't regard the gods as good or bad, or even the notion of good and bad as such, not quite in the way the Christians did. They saw things more as order and chaos, neither of them good or bad in themselves, but simply two natural and normal states of existence made up of various aspects complementing each other, like the Chinese yin and yang, the gods representing aspects of life. Freya represented one aspect, Hel represented another, and in her case, an aspect that was an integral part of life. Death follows life just as night follows day, so they would not have seen her as some evil being who brought a nasty end to people's existence, but more as an admittedly dark, yet in her own way, a shining being coming to continue the circle of life. She would have been worshipped just as were the other gods, and in fact possibly more so than many of the others, since your chances of coming face to face with Odin or Thor or Freya, well, it was pretty slim after all, but you were most definitely going to meet Hel at some stage. Oh, yeah. Everyone, highborn or peasant, noble or thrall, everyone was going to meet Hel at some time or other. So worshipping her to let her know how much you regarded her, probably wasn't a bad idea. I saw a question on a Facebook pagan site from someone who asked, was it safe to worship Hel? As they'd been told, it wasn't a good idea. I suppose sort of based on the idea that don't bring yourself to the attention of the death goddess just in case she might be short of the monthly quota. I, of course, posted that Hel was not herself evil. She didn't bring death, it brought her, and worship of her was perfectly safe, since she didn't kill people whenever she fancied. She simply came for them when they died, so until your time to go came along, well, she wasn't going to bother you. On that point, I would be inclined to think that perhaps Thor and Hel were among the most worshipped of all the gods, one being the protector of Midgard, where people lived, and the other, the one they'd all meet when they stopped living. And ceremonies to honour the dead and ask for their help and protection were common among the Norse. A bloat or sacrifice to the dead was a normal practice, and would have often involved Hel, since the dead they were appealing to and honouring resided in her realm and could do nothing without her permission. Such a bloat would often be held beside the grave of the one being honoured, perhaps on or close to one of the burial mounds so common in Scandinavia, or at a crossroads, all places associated with death, and of course Hel as its representative. And necromancy was a common practice. It survived in Iceland well into the Middle Ages, practiced by those who still followed the old gods, though probably they kept very quiet about that. Now, when I say necromancy, I don't mean it in the sense of raising the dead from their graves to act as servants to the living. Zombies climbing out of gaping holes in the ground, if you like, going around going, ugh. No, that's a later idea that really belongs in old Hollywood Bela Lugosi B movies. But no, I mean necromancy as a way of merely contacting the dead, to ask for their protection, as I've said, or for their wisdom, their guidance to the living, invoking Hel in the process. Odin, for example, rides to Hel to raise Volva from the dead and ask her for her wisdom, which, of course, he could only do with the consent of the goddess. Even Odin bowed to Hel in her own realm. I'm sure Hel would have been worshipped and invoked extensively. She would have been on a par at least with most of the other gods, but she was transformed by Christian thinking into a minor goddess of evil, committing all sorts of nasty deeds in her woefully dismal little hole in the ground. So how do I regard Hel? The goddess, that is, not the realm. But personally, I like her. I see her as I'm sure the Norse would in ancient times, neither good nor bad, though she represents both qualities, since dying may be seen as a bad thing, yet at the same time it is also a good thing in cases where someone is in terrible pain, for example, when Hel could be a most welcome visitor, as I've mentioned already. Hel has a task to receive and care for those who die, and that is what she does. There is nothing bad or evil about that. She does not kill people herself, merely takes them when something else kills them. In that regard, she is no more evil than an undertaker. He has no responsibility for the people lying on his slab, just as she has no responsibility for death itself. She does not choose how or why people die. And she is not, as I said, the goddess of death. She is the goddess of the dead, the custodian of those who are dead. She has no more to do with death itself than does the warden of a prison have to do with crime. He or she simply takes care of those who've committed it. In the context of Ragnarok, I suppose we may see Hel taking a more direct involvement with death itself, if she leads the dead out of her realm to join the battle, but in that scenario, everyone is taking sides. Ron might start chucking people into the sea rather than waiting for ships to sink and drown them, or Idun might start throwing apples at the enemy, since I doubt she'd be very well practiced with a sword. I've noticed quite a lot of comments from people on YouTube and other sites that show perhaps a growing realization of Hel's true character in the Old Norse sense, not a Christianized image as portrayed by Snorri, nor the annoyingly ludicrous presentation of her in the Thor Ragnarok movie. One saw her as welcoming, accepting all who came to her, seeing her like a mother, taking her children home, caring for them, while another regarded her as a gentle, not an evil or a scary goddess, a caring goddess. A nurse who had witnessed the suffering of dying patients saw her as the relief of that suffering. And there are those who regard her as their favourite goddess, worshipping her in our own time and having altars dedicated to her, much like the one you see behind me in these videos. Mine, incidentally, is to Freya. Such views are more representative of the truth, I think, of how Hel would have been seen by the Norse people, rather than the image of this evil, deformed hag glowering and cackling in a subterranean cavern of utter misery and despair. No. To conclude, I'll relate a curious but true story that happened to a man I know. A story very relevant to this video. Make of it what you will. This man was seriously ill. He was hemorrhaging very, very badly, not expected to live. He was dying. Something he knew when he was admitted to the hospital. As he was being taken into emergency surgery, a woman appeared in front of him. A woman he recognized instantly, he being of Scandinavian descent and knowing something of the old ways. A woman who was apparently both alive and dead. She was the goddess Hel. Indeed, she could be no other. Now she smiles. She tells him not to worry, that he is going to live. But she is going to do something very special for him. She is going to change him. She thrusts her hand into his chest and takes his heart, holding it and doing something or other with it. She then puts it back. She tells him that she has altered him, that his life will be very, very different in the future. She smiles and then she vanishes. When he woke up in the recovery room, his first thought, well, probably his second thought actually, I suppose his first would be actually discovering that he was still alive, was to remember his dream, which of course he assumed it to have been. However, he suddenly realized that he could see dead people, and he could talk to them, something of course he'd never been able to do previously. After that, he began to study shamanism. He is now a practicing shaman. Now, he has never published this story. He has never used it in any way to gain attention. He has never put it online. So it is not some sort of publicity stunt. Oh, look at me! I was saved by a death goddess. Yeah, sort of thing. No, so the use of it for publicity, to gain attention, to get people to follow him, can be ruled out. Did hell come to him? Or someone or something taking her form? And interestingly enough, taking not the form she would actually have, but rather that which she might expect someone today to recognize, the half-corpse of the modern artist's conception. That would make sense, I suppose. Just as if, well, let us say the Virgin Mary wanted to appear to a devout Catholic, one used to seeing her depicted in those very incorrect statues and paintings that one sees in churches. Fair complexion, blue eyes, honey blonde hair. No, the Virgin Mary would probably not come as she would actually have looked, a Jewess of the first century with dark complexion, brown eyes, and either dark brown or black hair. The Catholic of today, I'm sure, saying to her, who the hell are you supposed to be? But why would hell come to that man in the first place? Her role was to take care of the dead, rather than give mortals the ability to see them, nor had she any responsibility to prevent anyone from dying. That something happened, well, it's unquestionable. But exactly what, and more importantly, why, is another question that, well, it really has no answer. It's easy to say it was a dream, but he could hardly dream himself the ability to see and communicate with the dead, assuming, of course, that you accept that he can do that. And you could ask, why would hell care, or any other entity that might take her form, for that matter, whether he could see dead people or not? Naturally, I suppose, given his experience, that man has a very special devotion to hell. He has written poems that in her honor. But that is the story, and as I said, make what you will of it. You know, I must say that if I were in fear of imminent death, and hell appeared in front of me, I think I'd probably have a heart attack and die long before she ever got the chance to tell me I wasn't going to. She'd have to explain that part on the way down the north, which, come to think of it, would be a bit late. Still, maybe she'd put some nice rushes on the benches and give me a feast when we got there. So that concludes this little chat on the subject of hell. I hope you enjoyed it, and for now I shall say farewell and bye till next time.